I'm sure it is making Hassan's heart sing to see this many interested well-wishers and concerned supporters out this evening on a Friday night. And I welcome the opportunity to share some reflections with you, and then actually more significantly, I'm really keen to hear from Dawn. But I know that we'll also have an opportunity for excellent engagement, and we'll be sure to leave ample time for that. So I've been asked to share thoughts and reflections about Hassan's case, and to do so in the context, I think many of you will know, there was reference to the book, but I'm just wrapping up delivering this year's CBC Massey lectures on the theme of universal renewing human rights in a fractured world. And you can just listen to that title and know that there's many ways in which that directly connects to and resonates with the concerns and challenges that Hassan has faced over these many, many long years. So that's the journey I'm going to take us on for maybe 40 minutes or so of reflecting on this theme of the universality of human rights, and taking us to some of the global challenges we face, but then also bringing us back to reminders about the significance and implications of that for Hassan himself. As we all know, Hassan Diab has now faced, I think almost to the day, 17 years of human rights denial, of human rights violations, and certainly of incredible human rights struggle. 17 years, but here's the rub, and it's why we're all together this evening: he still does. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights assures him that should not be so. Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Article 2, everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind. Article 3, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. Article 5, no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Article 7, all are equal before the law and are entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of the law. Article 8, everyone has the right to an effective remedy. Article 9, no one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. Article 10, everyone is entitled to full equality, to a fair and public hearing. Article 11, everyone, you notice a bit of a repetition of a word here, everyone charged with a penal offense has the right to be presumed innocent. Article 12, no one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with their privacy, nor to attacks upon their honor and reputation. Article 13, everyone has the right to freedom of movement. And so on. I could go on through most of the provisions of the Universal Declaration, so many of the provisions of the Declaration that speak to the dismantling of the universal human rights promise for Hassan over these past 17 years. The dismantling of the promise not only for Hassan, but also for his family. What of the Universal Declaration, therefore, for Hassan Diab? Well, the word universal is from the Latin, universus, meaning altogether, whole, or entire. And sit with it for a minute. It's a word it's an idea, a word that is all-encompassing for everyone and everywhere. At times, it shouts to us with passion and confidence, for when universal is on full display, it can truly be magnificent. In other moments, it speaks tentatively, certainly with anxious hesitation, for its full extent eludes us. And when we are honest, we acknowledge that universality is in fact far too often deliberately betrayed. We live in a time of what feels to be unprecedented global turmoil, hate, and division. Truth is under siege and disinformation is on the rise. Legal and democratic norms and institutions are under attack. On a rapidly warming planet, we face the gravest ever threat to our well-being and even our survival. The inherent sacredness of human life is aggressively contested from countless directions. This is not universality's finest hour, but it can be. In the raw aftermath of the Second World War and the Holocaust, as governments elaborated the world's first set of comprehensive global human rights promises, this is the word they chose. In 1948, they proclaimed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And universal was an unconventional title for an international legal instrument. The drafters of the Declaration were saying, this is for all of us. All of us. Well, in 2025, the word still packs a powerful punch, but it also screams to us of our profound failure to keep the promise. For we are far from a world in which the human rights of all are equally acknowledged, let alone respected. What we confidently placed at the core of the promise, its universality, is above all else where we have fallen so desperately short. And thus, we are here tonight, heavy with the knowledge that we have fallen grievously short for nearly 2 decades in lifting the universal promise up for Hassan Diab. But there is also another side to universality's power in our world, for even as a maelstrom of violence, hate, and lies frays the fabric of universal human rights, billions of people continue to hold the promise close. They resist and organize precisely because the promise is universal. They do so even though the promise has been withheld from them. Here, universality is linked to courage and imagination. It is fueled by conviction and hard work. It is nourished by solidarity, and it speaks truth that ultimately cannot be denied. This universality rises above divisive lies and manufactured hate. This universality unites us in something hopeful and good. And that is also the universality that brings all of us together tonight, united in our shared insistence that Hassan's rights be embraced and respected, and our determination to make that so. In early 2019, I was interviewing Rohingya refugees who had fled genocidal attacks in Myanmar and were now living in overcrowded and dangerous refugee camps in Bangladesh. And I spent time with a man named Mohammed Salim. And Mohammed spoke to me of drowning. We drowned in waves of violence and hate spread by Facebook in Myanmar, he said. We nearly drowned as we made our way across the Naf River. Our boat had holes in it and the water was pouring in. We have nearly drowned many times here in the camp when the monsoons have brought rain and mud. Our desperate friends and family drown when they go out into the Bay of Bengal, hoping to make it somewhere safe, but their unsafe ships sink or are lost. Now they want to drown us by sending us to live in a prison camp for refugees on a flooded sandbar island far out in the ocean. And we drown every day in the camp because we are locked up like criminals, don't have enough food, and our children are not allowed to go to school. We Rohingya are forgotten and left to drown. But when I learned about the Universal Declaration, I knew that it holds promise as a lifeboat, he said. Well, I can assure you that the last thing I expected to hear about and to see as I stooped to enter Mohammed's tiny, immaculate shelter in Jamtoli refugee camp was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But there it was, faded and curled at the edges, pinned to the central post supporting the blue plastic sheeting that was home to Mohammed, his wife, their 4 young children, and his wife's elderly parents. Drowning is an apt metaphor for all that the Rohingya have been through. Drowning literally while crossing rivers or taking to the high seas to reach safety, or when faced with the wrath of monsoon rains and flooding. drowning figuratively under waves of violence and hate in person and online, and a punitive existence in the refugee camps, drowning with no end in sight. As they fled the genocidal violence in Myanmar in 2017, Mohammed had watched as his beloved uncle was shot and killed in front of him. At the time, the world was moved by the ferocious attacks and indescribable suffering inflicted upon the Rohingya. But today, with a global shrug of indifference, their plight seems forgotten. Mohammed's family is now among 1 million refugees crammed into camps with no prospect of returning home. What was most compelling about that conversation with Mohammed is that it ended not, as we might expect, in hopelessness, but with hope. For he saw hope promised in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a lifeboat for humanity, as he said. Yet the world has yet to ensure that the lifeboat will be seaworthy. Mohammed's experience speaks to so many of the world's ongoing ruptures, mass atrocities and repression, climate crisis, hate and polarization, economic deprivation, the reach of social media, the immense scale of forced displacement. These crises are not only urgent, they are existential. They go deep into the heart of how we live our lives, how we view each other, and how we relate to the natural world on which our very existence depends. All of it ever so more daunting, given that the rules-based legal frameworks we have counted on to bring some degree of order to our world are collapsing. The United Nations is more deadlocked than ever under the Security Council's dysfunctional watch, enabled by the disgraceful veto power wielded, threatened, or simply anticipated to be used by 3 of the 5 permanent members, the United States, Russia, and China, without the slightest concern for law, morality, or just plain human decency. Under their watch, genocide has marched on unimpeded, unconcerned, day in and day out in Gaza, where the humanity of Palestinians is denied. The blatantly unlawful invasion of Ukraine is never taken up, not one single resolution. And while wrenching crises in the Sudan, Afghanistan, and Myanmar deepen, so too do the excuses for and thus normalization of inaction. Disavowal of international law abounds. Authoritarian leaders are winning elections. And I don't know about you, but for me, there is frequent dinner table and street corner talk even now of rising fascism, including at the White House. Awash in this sea of disinformation and the rapid demise of truth, we are left with an increasingly wobbly tiller in Mohammed's lifeboat, held together with rubber bands and duct tape with which to navigate these turbulent waters. But we do nevertheless have that lifeboat. And no matter how leaky or wobbly, Mohammed Salim and millions upon millions of people everywhere are intent on steering it to safe harbor. So must we. And tonight, we join Hassan in that lifeboat, and our hands link with his on that tiller. This year's Massey Lectures, which I have just had the great good fortune to deliver across the country alongside a slate of other events and side trips in cities large and small, remote towns, grand theaters, and tiny corners of public libraries, have given me the opportunity to explore the frank reality, yes, the urgent necessity, absolutely, but also the magnificent possibility of that promise of universal human rights. The high-level takeaway, spoiler alert, because I all want you to listen to the lectures on ideas next week, is that I have heard and seen hope at every stop along the way. Hope with audiences of over 1,000 people, hope sitting quietly with a small group of 12. hope out on the land, hope that rests in a deep concern but determination to work for change that has been on display, has been vibrating in every audience. And I feel that here tonight. I have heard repeatedly from Canadians well into their 90s and as young as 6 years old that they believe in human rights. And they refuse to accept a world in which the universality of our human rights is dismissed, denigrated, and denied. In the lectures, I have explored the heavy reality that our world is fractured in many, many ways, fractures that have ruptured the human rights of billions of people through the global climate emergency, genocide and atrocities, repression, hate and authoritarianism, forced displacement and economic inequality, and the unrelenting, insidious march of technology into every corner of our lives. Fractures, though, that can be healed by a true embrace of universal human rights. I've looked behind us to the reminder of the essential beliefs and truths that lie at the heart of the universal human rights promise, going back far, millennia, in fact, long before the promise was enshrined in the Universal Declaration in 1948. We see it in indigenous teachings, religious and spiritual parables, the reflections of philosophers, and the rallying cries of the momentous times of revolution and rebellion throughout human history. It tells us that life is sacred, that we are joined together in a sense of common humanity, and that we all yearn and deserve fairness and freedom. I have taken stock of our unforgivable failure to acknowledge that universal human rights are inherent and inalienable. This document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, uses precisely those two words, inherent and inalienable, meaning we are all born with them and they can never be stripped away. But instead, human rights have become an exclusive club, steeped in white, moneyed, patriarchal privilege. Exclusion is rooted in sexism and misogyny, racism and intolerance, political domination, and economic exploitation. And that brings me to the man, the case, and the human rights travesty that brings us together this evening, Hassan Diab. In 2008, Hassan was effectively expelled from the Human Rights Club. Ever since, the governments and the courts of both Canada and France, yes, not one, but two countries, have ignored his inherent rights, and they have stripped him of his inalienable rights. What it starkly reminds us is that over the decades, though membership in the Human Rights Club has expanded somewhat, and certainly selectively, and outer circles of what we might consider to be auxiliary membership have grown to a degree, and always tenuous, but the clubhouse remains surrounded by fences of geopolitics, money, racism, sexism, intolerance, and indifference, which at times seem unbreachable. One of those fences, one of the ones that keeps Hassan out of the club, is national security and the fallacy that governments still embrace that to be more secure in our world, we have to violate human rights. What are the rights of one innocent man if it appears that the state is bolstering security in ignoring those rights? That is very much what I saw back in August of 2023 when I traveled to Qamishli, a small city in northeast Syria along the Turkish border, as part of a Canadian civil society delegation. The security situation at the time was tense, with frequent attacks by the Turkish military and worry about ISIS sleeper cells. We were seeking access to 23 Canadians, 13 of them children, who had been unlawfully detained in camps and prisons for over 6 years. None of them had been charged with an offense. They had no access to lawyers. Their detention conditions were harsh and dangerous. There was a constant risk of violence and abuse from guards and other detainees. There was not enough food, and health care was minimal at best. The camps and prisons were desperately overcrowded, and tuberculosis was rampant. There had been little access to the region for journalists and researchers. Their stories, which were both complicated and compelling, were simply not being told. More than 60,000 foreign nationals from some 60 countries were being held in similar circumstances, over half of them children. They had been rounded up when the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, backed by the United States, defeated ISIS, which had, of course, been responsible for unspeakable atrocities during the years of its self-proclaimed caliphate in parts of Syria and Iraq. Many of the male prisoners were indeed ISIS militants that had been responsible for heinous crimes and should face justice. But in those same prisons were thousands of other men and boys who had no connection or had even opposed ISIS. In the camps, alongside women who were followers of ISIS, were others who were its victims, including many who had been trafficked into the region, and even Yazidi refugees who had fled ISIS in Iraq because Syria seemed like a marginally safer place to go. And again, well over half were children. In this cauldron of insecurity and injustice, the Canadian government was refusing to provide its citizens with consular support or to bring them home, where they could, if appropriate, be tried in Canadian courts under Canadian law. The prevailing sentiment simply tarred everyone with one lazy narrative of guilt. They knew the risks of traveling to Syria, even the children apparently, and now they had to face the consequences. We were given access to all of the women and children, but only 2 of the 9 men we had asked to see. We learned nothing about the fate of the other 7 men. Their names, written on the first page of my notebook, haunted me then and still do. Northeast Syria was not ruled from Damascus. The de facto governing authority was the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria. We had several meetings with local officials, including a lengthy session with 2 individuals who had the daunting responsibility of delivering justice in the conditions I'd just described. The area was ravaged by war and surrounded by security threats. Infrastructure had been destroyed, the economy ruined, and lawyers and judges had been killed or displaced to other countries. Yet those 2 officials were expected to bring tens of thousands of people to justice. In evident need of assistance, the administration had reached out to foreign governments, including Canada, asking that they take their nationals back and deliver justice at home. That request was rebuffed. They asked states to consider setting up an international tribunal to at least try the most serious cases. There was no interest. They asked for resources to support local trials. None was forthcoming. Amina, a senior judge overseeing this caseload, was clear that the task would be immensely difficult. Remarkably, she was equally clear about the human rights principles she intended to abide by, including that every accused would have a lawyer, trials would be fair, there would be a right to appeal, and there would even be no resort to the death penalty. She told us that delivering justice in Northeast Syria had to be, quote, true to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I can assure you I had not arrived in Northeast Syria expecting anyone to refer to the Universal Declaration in any of our meetings. I wrote her stirring words in my notebook, but with 2 large question marks. For while it was encouraging to hear the Declaration referenced as a source of truth at the same time it was being so wholly disregarded by local officials and a host of nations, including Canada, who had decided that thousands of men, women, and children simply did not deserve those rights. One of the men our delegation had asked to see was Jack Letts, whose mother, Sally Lane, lived only a few blocks from me here in Ottawa. Jack had been imprisoned for over 6 years at the time, and it had been so long since the family last had news of him that they anguished as to whether he was even still alive. Jack had been a dual national of the United Kingdom and Canada until he was arbitrarily stripped of his UK citizenship while locked up in Syria. His rights literally stripped away. He remained a Canadian citizen, but Canada had no interest in bringing him home. He was deemed unworthy of assistance. But he wasn't charged with any crime. And there was no legal process, not in Syria, not in the United Kingdom, not in Canada, open to him to defend himself and seek to win his freedom. For days, Syrian Kurdish authorities gave us no straight answer. First, we were simply told we could not see any of the men. Then, they were looking into it. Next, they told us they could not find Jack. It was only in the final hours of our last night on the ground that we suddenly received permission, and we rushed to the prison where he was being held. I had come with letters, books, photos, and even recorded video messages from his family that the prison director actually let me play for Jack. He was allowed to write a short note back to them. Jack teared up several times, as did most of us who were in the room, including prison officials. And for a moment, it actually felt like universal human rights had found their way into that prison. At the end of our visit, Jack asked me whether I thought he would still be there in another 10 years. How to respond? I did not want to crush his hope. I did not want to raise false hope. I sought a cautious middle ground. I told him there was no immediate prospect of his release, but I was hopeful that he might be free within 1 year. Much of that hope lay with optimism that the Supreme Court of Canada would agree to hear an appeal of a lawsuit he was part of. But astonishingly, 3 months later, the Supreme Court decided not even to hear the case. And today, more than 2 years after our visit, he remains imprisoned in Syria. By birth and from birth, Jack was able to turn to 2 governments to keep the human rights promise. The United Kingdom firmly turned its back and took the promise away from him, and Canada sits on its hands. But Jack's rights have not been extinguished. He is not somehow no longer in the club. I checked in with Sally as I was finalizing the book that accompanies the Massey lectures. She described the anguished limbo in which they remain trapped. As she put it, when we say that everyone has rights, but then we arbitrarily deny some people the ability to pursue justice when their rights are violated, and don't even let them mount a challenge to being unlawfully detained, then do any of us truly have rights in the end? It was a rhetorical question, obviously, but it's an important one. Do any of us truly have rights? Captures the essential human rights challenge we all face. It is the question that Hassan's plight presents. The answer should be, of course we do. But unless and until we deliver that promise for everyone, the true answer remains maybe yes, maybe not, maybe today, maybe not tomorrow. That's obviously not good enough, not for Jack, not for Hassan, and not for any of us in this room tonight. We are all born with rights. None of us lose our rights. All human beings are, after all, born free and equal in dignity and rights. Back in Syria, conditions in the camps have worsened, particularly following massive US funding cuts for humanitarian assistance. The Trump administration intends to withdraw all US forces from Syria, which will almost certainly have dramatic implications for stability in the northeast. And while the overall security situation in Syria has tentatively improved following the overthrow of the brutal al-Assad regime last year. What that means for the prisons and camps remains uncertain. Meanwhile, the universal human rights of 16 Canadians, 7 of them young children, and thousands of others unlawfully locked up simply do not count. Except that their rights do count. The Universal Human Rights Promise extends to everyone who was abandoned in northeast Syria, just as it extends fully to Hassan Diab and to every one of the 8,258,104,219 people in every imaginable corner of our planet. It is not a matter of whether they are rich or poor, popular or shunned, innocent or guilty, radical or not, citizens or migrants, white or not white, facing extradition or living undisturbed. The promise is theirs for one simple reason: they are human. The Universal Declaration begins by recognizing the inherent dignity and the inalienable rights of all members of the human family. That means from the moment of birth. There's nothing we need to accomplish before we are deemed to have earned our rights. We do not need to demonstrate that we are worthy. Inherent refers to something that is so embedded in or naturally part of something else as to be inseparable. And the necessary companion to rights being inherent is that they are inalienable, meaning they cannot be taken away, repudiated, or even surrendered if we wanted to give them up. Not only do we not have to earn our rights, we do not lose them. The promise extends to all of us from our first breath to our last. Yet just as we see in the prison and detention camps of northeast Syria and in the travesty of justice that has consumed Hassan's life for 17 years, human rights are denied and stripped all the time, eviscerating the very idea of universality. But how can that be in Canada? Surely that is not the case when it comes to our regard for universal human rights. We are, after all, the believers, are we not? The Canadian government would not willfully and deliberately abandon its own citizens to a human rights no-go zone in northeast Syria, would we? We would not strip Hassan Diab, a Canadian citizen, of his universal human rights and serve him up as a political scapegoat, would we? Canadians are inclined to feel pretty self-satisfied about human rights. In a survey a decade ago, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, in fact, ranked as the symbol that best expressed Canadian identity, ahead of the flag, the RCMP, national anthem, and yes, even hockey. A 2022 poll ranked the Charter and our healthcare system equally. And there are many reasons to take pride in Canada's contributions to universal human rights. That includes such consequential breakthroughs, of course, as UN peacekeeping, the landmines ban, the International Criminal Court, and strengthened protections for child soldiers. Canada's resettlement of Indo-Chinese refugees earned us the Nansen Award, the equivalent of the Nobel Peace Prize for refugee protection. Canada has been a leading advocate globally for women's equality, including sexual and reproductive rights in recent years, and for the rights of 2S LGBTQI+ individuals. We, of course, defied our US and UK allies to oppose apartheid in South Africa, and we said no to George Bush's unlawful invasion of Iraq. All true. There are many other chapters to our human rights story not so proud and still unresolved, and new chapters are being written as we speak, as we anticipate Donald Trump. We try to distance ourselves from his chaos and cruelty, yet the universal human rights dial is shifting, and governments, including our own, are gravitating to where he has set the debate. And that has meant massive increases in military spending and border enforcement, to the detriment of already sparse humanitarian budgets, which are more urgently needed than ever. There's not much talk of human rights in that climate. For instance, we have remained silent as Donald Trump eviscerates the rights of refugees and migrants. We maintain the indefensible line that there is no need to suspend the so-called safe third country agreement between our two countries because the United States, in our view, apparently still remains safe for refugees. Such reticence underscores a pernicious impact of the Trump agenda. Reluctant to push back, worried about reprisals, the international community, including Canada, risks normalizing what he has unleashed. Many world leaders, of course, eagerly join him in shredding the universal human rights promise. Canada's response cannot be indifference, let alone complicity, but bold determination to take a different path. In the Massey lectures, I build towards a 6-point agenda that I lay out at the end for a way forward. I did so just a few blocks from here at the National Arts Centre, in fact, 2 weeks ago. Each point, and this is important to always remind ourselves, means, amongst other things, getting our own human rights house in order. We need to thoroughly reimagine the place of universal human rights in our world. This is a moment to overhaul our systems and structures, elevate human rights, and challenge ourselves personally, collectively, in our own lives to live differently. A time for renewal, building on what we have created while reconceiving something different with a heightened sense of purpose. The universal human rights renewal that I imagine has 6 key elements. Put human rights first, embrace universality and commit to equality, protect human rights defenders and the right to protest, ensure justice, be expansive, and believe in and champion human rights. It really needs to be a collective pledge. Yes, one that we demand of our governments, but also one that we expect of ourselves. Let me end quickly with those 6 points and then some reflections on how it connects up with Hassan's situation. So number 1, put human rights first. There's always an excuse, isn't there? Always an excuse for putting human rights on hold. One day, not now, there are other priorities. Human rights, they're really going to be a distraction. Oh, human rights, they are so expensive. Honestly, we just don't care. But universal human rights were never intended to be for later. In fact, the Universal Declaration talks of human rights being the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. A solid foundation, not a leaky roof. Delaying human rights robs them of their purpose. We need to begin with human rights. After all, how can we expect the universal promise of human rights to be kept if it is always left for another day, and a day after that, and a year beyond that, and a decade down the road? Number 2, embrace universality and commit to equality. Nothing has eroded the promise of human rights in our world more than the failure to extend it universally and equally to everyone, and universally and equally with respect to all rights. Human rights will soar only when their universality is embraced. Human rights will not provide the protection they promise, nor the solutions they offer, until they are upheld universally and equally. Number 3, protect defenders and protesters. We need to recognize the essential role of human rights defenders and peaceful protest in society as sentinels of human rights protection and the lifeblood of democracy. No one ever should be killed, threatened, or silenced for defending human rights or speaking out when they are violated. And we need to be ready to be those defenders and protesters ourselves. Number 4, ensure justice. Enforcement of the universal promise is nigh impossible if there is no effective remedy to turn to when rights are violated. Any promise, human rights or otherwise, rises or falls on whether it is kept. Wishful thinking is not enough. When the universal human rights promise is broken, justice must step in. Justice must make wrongs right. Otherwise, injustice only grows. Number 5, be expansive. Renewing human rights compels us to ensure the promise responds to needs that were either left out or not yet imagined when the Universal Declaration was written in 1948. For human rights, while universal, are not static. They are multifaceted and dynamic and must evolve as we evolve. It is tempting to retreat to safeguarding existing rights frameworks that are under attack and buckling. And of course we must. But we must also be expansive and ensure human rights are relevant to the grave challenges of today, including by evolving our understanding of human rights and what steps we will take to uphold them. And then lastly, number 6, believe in and champion human rights. If ever there's been a time, this is it. Silence is not an option. Silence, in fact, is destructive. We all know the words. Martin Luther King Jr. famously reminds us that in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. We must forge that world in which there is no silence because we stand together in solidarity with those whose rights are on the line. In doing so, we make it clear that we are not indifferent to genocide, to a burning planet, to sexism, racism, and discrimination, to erasing trans lives, to shutting borders to refugees, to homelessness. We are certainly not indifferent to our responsibility to advance rights regarding reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. We are not indifferent to efforts that tear down our common humanity. We are not indifferent to breaking the promise of universal human rights. And tonight, we are absolutely clear. We are not indifferent to a friend, a colleague, a neighbor, a husband and father, a professor, a fellow Canadian being denied those rights, being denied his rights with no end in sight. Hassan's case offers the perfect opportunity to rise to what those 6 points call us to do. We put human rights first by ensuring that his rights to be protected from arbitrary arrest, unlawful detention, unjust extradition, unfair trials, torture and ill treatment, and discrimination and racism are finally given their due and will indeed come first, more important than any sensitivities in our relationship with France. We embrace universality and commit to equality by banishing any notion that Hassan is not a full member of the Human Rights Club. His rights matter no less than the rights of than any of our rights do. We show how important it is to defend human rights and to protest when they are violated by doing so on behalf of Hassan, tonight, tomorrow, and for as long as it takes. We ensure justice by demanding, quite obviously, that justice be done, which is as simple and definitive as ending the runaway, unjust, and seemingly unaccountable extradition process gone so terribly wrong for nearly 2 decades now. We challenge ourselves to be expansive by recognizing that the unprecedented nature of Hassan's case. After all, it's not every day that one person has faced the prospect of being extradited from Canada twice for the same alleged crime, requires an unprecedented and innovative response. Yes, innovative, but a response which is most assuredly within reach. And finally, we show that we believe and are resolutely prepared to champion the promise of universal human rights by refusing to remain silent and by taking up all possible avenues for spreading the word about Hassan's case and of the steps that can and must be taken to restore the universal human rights promise to him. That, ultimately, rests in the hands of Prime Minister Carney, Foreign Affairs Minister Anand, and Public Safety Minister Ananda Sangare, and most critically and directly, our Minister of Justice and Attorney General, Sean Fraser. In keeping with the universality of the promise of human rights, Minister Fraser must simply say no to France. It's just one word: no. Make it clear that Hassan Diab's rights come first. They supersede the politics of Canada's relationship with France. They come before all other considerations. And that requires taking a resolute stand against any further possibility of another unfair and unjust extradition. It may be unusual to do so, but protecting human rights often requires unusual steps. Silence, in this case, the silence of the Canadian government, is not and cannot be an option. The point is this: when we believe, when we are empowered and bound to one another in solidarity, when we spread the word and protest, when we overcome doubt by making human rights real, when we defend human rights, when we set out to make change happen, we can and do prevail. Our collective determination has advanced the universal promise of human rights in the past so often. It can and it must do so again. And it can and it must do so for Hassan. After all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights. Thank you very much. No, fair enough. I assure you, I do not shy away from speaking out about what is happening in Gaza. Fair comment that it didn't get a lot of airplay in those comments. It is covered extensively throughout the Massey lectures. I spent this morning at the Palestine Tribunal for Canadian Responsibility. I'll be back there tomorrow chairing a session. So I just want to put that on the table to assure you, if you had some concern that I'm soft or ambivalent about what's happening with respect to the situation in Gaza, I want you to know quite the contrary. And I think you're absolutely right. There's no question that what is happening, not only what is happening on the ground in Gaza, but the pathetic, hypocritical, deceitful, meaningless, duplicitous, I can go on, response from the international community, with Canada sadly not only in the mix, but way up at the top of the list, is a disgrace in and of itself, but also is having toxic impact on the strength and effectiveness and even the very meaning of our international rules-based order. And it is absolutely incumbent, therefore, upon all of us to go back to some of the themes that I mentioned. I think perhaps maybe above all else what comes to mind, and I know many people, even people who totally are of a mind that what is happening on the ground in Gaza constitutes genocide and other mass atrocities, find it difficult to speak out, and that we need to do everything we can to encourage each other to break that silence, because if there is one thing that is very pernicious at this moment in history for the people of Gaza, but then also for the strength and future of universal human rights in our world, it is that silence. I think you're also very right to point to that having very direct implications and connection to what has been happening for Hassan. There's a lot of political considerations that swirl around why his case has been handled the way it has in France. I'm sure we're going to hear much more meaningfully and thoughtfully from Don Bain about that in particular. And that's both about very specific political considerations and obviously the power of family members and key leaders within the Jewish community in France, exerting political pressure, unrelentingly for many, many years. And then it's also now impacted by the much more debilitating and divisive global politics around Israel and Palestine. And as has often been the case with Hassan, he shows up in the middle of that as a hapless scapegoat. And I think that goes a long way to explaining why he has been subjected to the injustices he has. Well, I do want you to begin by saying I am Kareem and I embrace humanitarianism and I believe in universal human rights. And if you can turn that into a sexy bumper sticker, go for it. I mean, words matter, and let's not be dismissive of the importance of words. And I think going back to my comments just in the previous question, but also in my remarks about the impact that silence has in deepening atrocities and injustice and repression, we always have to be very aware of that. But are words enough? Clearly not. And are our own words enough? They matter, but we need more. So what I would point to is that for us individually, we need to look for the ways that we can build beyond words. And that doesn't mean that everyone's going to suddenly become the leader who organizes the rally with 50,000 people on Parliament Hill a week from Saturday. But if Kareem is up to that, go for it. We need everything. We need people behind the scenes. We need people to play whatever role they can through actions, through deeds, not only through words, in advancing universal human rights. The other piece of that is to seek out common cause, to seek partners and allies and build those bonds of solidarity with friends, neighbors, and across movements and halfway around the world. It is obviously, when it comes to both words and deeds, it is our collective strength that ultimately becomes irresistible and invincible. Just let me end with saying, throughout the lectures, I have found myself often referencing what is one of my favorite human rights quotes of all time, which is actually from Eleanor Roosevelt, who, as many people will know here, played an instrumental role in the early days of the international human rights system coming into being. She was the first chair of the UN's Commission on Human Rights. She chaired the drafting committee that eventually adopted the UN Declaration. And at the 10-year anniversary point of the Universal Declaration, so this is back in 1958, she was giving a talk in which she'd been asked to reflect on, what is this thing called universal human rights all about anyway? And she had this lovely line where she said, universal human rights begin in the small places close to home. I'm sure many of you know this quote. So small and so close to home that we can't find them on any map of the world. But unless and until we can lift up human rights in those places, they will not flourish in the wider world. And I think that's also something, therefore, I would kind of use in response to your question is reminding ourselves that yes, we do need to be focused on the big challenges in our world, and anything any of us can do to figure out how to tackle Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin and Benjamin Netanyahu, bring it on. But we also need to think about close to home. We need to think about how we're interacting with our friends and neighbors, whether we're being the witness that stands up to a momentary instance of racism or sexism we witness in our workplace, whether we are breaking the silence just within our own little networks, and that we should not be dismissive somehow, that doesn't matter, that's not enough. I think especially at a time right now when it's so easy to feel lost and overwhelmed and despairing, and the forces that are marshaled against us want us to feel that. That is their intention. We begin by reclaiming and reminding and reaffirming and embracing our power by looking for those things that are within our orbit, that we can do tomorrow, that we can do with a friend, that we can see kind of some tangible progress. And while that may not end genocide in Gaza tomorrow or kick Vladimir Putin out of Ukraine, it all builds towards that ultimate goal. So I guess that would be the other thing I would share in response to you. I thought that was very eloquently put, your question, is no word and no deed is too small, especially at a time like this.